Hi, and welcome to the discussion. I'm Tim Harwood, and this is Anya Heath. Privacy is a person's interest to control the access of others to themselves. It seems like a basic right to be able to exercise control and autonomy over your life, and be able to determine what facets you wish to be private or public. However, what happens when your career is based partially, or sometimes even fully, on the publicization of your private life? It is commonly accepted that fame comes at a price, and that price is privacy. In the celebrity world, the lines between what is public and what is private become blurred, and the question arises, do celebrities have the same right to privacy as us? And more importantly, are these rights respected? Nothing highlights the debate of celebrity privacy more than a celebrity death. When a celebrity dies, it becomes an event. True to the old newsroom saying, if it bleeds, then it leads. In this program, we will discuss the ethics of reporting on celebrity death. In particular, we will look at the death of Bobbi Kristina Brown. So Anya, can you please give us the lowdown on this case?
It will be my pleasure, Tim. The story goes like this. Bobbi Kristina Brown, daughter of the late and great Whitney Houston, died at age 22 on the 25th of July 2015, 6 months after she was found unconscious and unresponsive in a bathtub. Brown was in a long-term relationship with Nick Gordon. The pair were raised as adoptive siblings by Whitney Houston and Bobbi Brown. The relationship was discouraged and known as a point of contention amongst the family. The death is now being considered a murder case, with Nick Gordon identified as a person of interest. This high-profile case is littered with controversy and scandal that sent the media into a veritable frenzy. Bobbi Kristina Brown's death was rich with news values. There is human interest value. A story about people, famous or not, are always popular reads. There is also plenty of conflict value. A news story that features or creates a debate will always be popular. You can see the conflict in numerous aspects in this case, including what we are going to be focusing on today, which is the capturing and subsequent sale of the picture of Brown in her casket to the media. The media in this instance were keen to purchase it as it allows them to utilise the news value of timeliness, which is when a story is new and current and exciting. Finally, this story, like any other celebrity death, features the news value of prominence, where a story is about a well-known person.
However, not all celebrity deaths are reported in the same way, and this is in part due to the fact that not all celebrities are famous in the same way. There are 5 different ways in which we classify fame, and each one of them affects how someone's privacy is considered by the media. Bobbi Kristina Brown would primarily be identified as having fame by association. Fame by association is where someone is famous for being associated with someone famous. In this case, it was Brown's mother, Whitney Houston. Within this classification, there are only a few instances where privacy can be justifiably breached. However, in her later years, Bobbi Kristina Brown made attempts to branch out on her own as a reality TV star, singer and actress. She was making attempts to create fame by achievement. This classification of fame often involves the active exchange of privacy for fame and wealth. The star understands that media coverage is a kind of currency in this exchange, and it is with this kind of fame that the lines between what does and does not breach privacy often become blurred. With all this in mind, let's cross over to Anna, who is at the scene where one of Brown's family members snapped a photo of Brown in her casket during what was supposed to be a private viewing. Anna, are you there?
Yes, Tim, certainly. I'm stood here at the site where an anonymous family member took a picture of Bobbi Kristina Brown as she lay in her casket during a private viewing. This act in itself is odd, but not notably unethical. However, the family member then went on to sell the photograph to the media for $100,000. At this point, what was meant to be a private viewing became public. It was an intrusion into the private space of the viewing, and as such should be treated as a breach of physical privacy. The question is, was this unethical or simply in poor taste? Back to you at the studio, Tim and Anya.
Thank you for that, Anna. In order to determine whether this is an unethical breach of privacy, let's first take a look at why we need a right to privacy. Privacy is important for psychological, sociological, economical, and political reasons. In the context of this case, privacy was important for the psychological and sociological reasons. Privacy is important in a psychological sense as people need private space in order to keep a healthy mental state. When the photograph of Brown in the casket was released, it inhibited on the private space the family had constructed in order to grieve. The incident reportedly erupted a war between the two sides of the family, with both the Houstons and Browns blaming each other. This family conflict is indicative of a psychological effect an invasion into a private space can have during such an emotionally tumultuous time. Sociologically, we need private space to feel comfortable and feel free to associate with others. The sociological reasoning to privacy is fundamental to freedom of expression. In this instance, the invasion into the private space of the viewing has affected the family's sense of freedom to express their bereavement with one another. As the comfort of what they trusted to be a private space had been compromised. This is especially so when you consider the photograph was taken by an unidentified family member. This ruptures the established trust between the family group, further inhibiting the family's ability to successfully grieve.
To elaborate on the dimensions of privacy, we're joined with psychology professor Erwin Altman. Thanks for joining us today, Erwin.
Oh, my pleasure, Anya. It's always good to look into your glistening eyes.
Oh, stop it, you. So you say that privacy is a multifaceted concept, is that correct?
Yes. Well, privacy does indeed serve three fundamental functions. The management of social interaction, the establishment of strategies for interacting with others, and finally, the manufacture of self-identity.
Well, that's all well and good, but how does that affect us?
The recognition of a multidimensional nature of privacy has promoted the categorization of privacy into four classes, each of which have different levels of legal protection attached to them. We have the privacy of person, the privacy of personal behaviour, privacy of personal communication, and privacy of personal data. But as Tim highlighted earlier, privacy goes beyond personal realms. Therefore, you need to consider privacy across 5 different dimensions instead. So that's physical, informational, psychological, economical, and sociological. In the case of Bobby Christina Brown's casket picture, I think it's quite right to say that the sociological and psychological realms of privacy were the dimensions that were primarily involved, along with the informational and the physical dimensions. Informationally speaking, the public obtained information that the family would have considered to be private in the form of the picture of Brown in the casket. Physically, it can be argued that the person who took the picture was physically intruding on what was meant to be a private space, even though they were invited. Sociologically, the family have the right to associate with each other without the fear of being observed. The intrusion of the privacy, in this case, has impinged upon this right, and the fibre of the family was evidently shaken by this. For me, the psychological dimension refers to the individual right to dignity. Privacy interests, in this case, refer to the right to control the disclosure of personal information. It is obvious that this right was stripped from Brown's family when that picture was taken.
Truly fascinating stuff. Erwin touched on how classifying privacy can help us formulate ways in which to protect our privacy. In relation to Brown's family, there are 2 ways in which governing bodies can protect their privacy. First, we have comprehensive laws, which refers to general laws that an overseeing body govern, which involve the collection, the use, and circulation of personal information. This approach is adopted by the EU in their data protection laws. Second, there are sectorial laws. This involves governing specific sector interests and is the approach the US have elected to adopt. This approach requires regular updates as new developments occur. This model involves a key disadvantage, as privacy protection laws in the US constantly play catch-up with the continual onslaught of technological development. For this reason, sectorial laws are often used in order to complement broader comprehensive laws.
We're joined here in the studio by US privacy protection lawyer Jennifer Penningworth, who is here to shed some light on the legality of the incident. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us, what kind of laws come into play here?
Well, as the lovely Irwin outlined, dimensions of privacy have different laws that apply. He also outlined that the dimensions involved in this case are the physical, the informational, the sociological, and the psychological. Now, the physical dimension has a few laws relating to it, but the one that would most apply here are to do with surveillance and listening devices. There are plenty of examples of these laws persecuting non-consensual capturing of images. For instance, in the past, a man was charged with the offensive behaviour for using a mobile phone camera to capture a photograph of a topless woman at a beach. In terms of Brown's casket picture, the law becomes more complex, as she was unable to give her consent. However, in this case, the general rule is if they do not explicitly consent, and the photo could be reasonably viewed as containing private information, then the photo shouldn't be taken in the first place.
Interesting stuff.
Very interesting indeed. Now next we have the informational dimension. Under this dimension, the laws surrounding the duty of confidence are of particular interest. Under this principle, when one party, which is what we call the confidant, acquires confidential information by virtue of his relationship with another, which we call the confider, the confidant is not usually at liberty to share that information with the third party without the consent of the confider. Whoever took the photo of the casket, in this case, is acting as the confidant, and the confider could be considered as Brown or the members of the family, who agreed to share the viewing together in privacy. From this blame game that followed, it is right to assume that the confidant at no point received any consent from the family to capture the image, and certainly didn't receive consent to sell the image to the press. The principle of the body of confidence also applies to the psychological dimension of privacy and the sociological dimension of privacy.
So you believe that the family's privacy was breached in a legal sense here?
Yes, I believe that the bodies of laws surrounding surveillance and listening devices and duty of confidence come into question here. Additionally, I think we should consider the 4 US torts relating to the right to personal privacy, 2 of which apply to what happened here. The first outlines that if someone intrudes, physically or otherwise, upon someone's private affairs, that they are subject to liability from the other person for the invasion of their privacy, if the intrusion would be considered highly offensive to a reasonable person. The second tort states that if someone gives unwarranted publicity to a matter concerning the private life of another person, they are subject to liability for the other person for the invasion of their privacy. However, the person is only subject to liability if the publicised matter is highly offensive to a reasonable person and if it is not of a legitimate concern to the public. In my opinion, I believe the parties involved in the sale of the photograph should both be liable, as the picture of Brown in her casket not only offensively intrudes on the family's private space, but the publication of the image itself is not only highly offensive to a reasonable person, but the image itself is of no legitimate concern to the public. The public had no need to see Brown in the casket. All the photo did was satisfy the public's intrigue. The media's defence here is that there was no harm done to Brown, who was the subject of the photographs and the centre of the media attention. However, I would say that it is the invasion of privacy that has caused harm and distress to the family of Bobby Christina Brown, and this is what breaches the tort of privacy. If, for instance, this had occurred in a public space rather than a private viewing, the privacy tort would have been proved to be of limited effect. This is due to the constitutional right to a free press, wherein if a subject is newsworthy and the newsworthy subject occurs in a public place, privacy protection takes a backseat to the US Constitution's First Amendment promise to protect the freedom of press. However, it is important to consider how the US system features the Bill of Rights, which emphasises the freedom of speech. In other countries, the right to privacy and the right to freedom of expression would be considered on an equal playing field, and these torts would be enough to see the parties involved made liable for their actions.
I see. So you believe what happened here is ethically questionable in the eyes of the law?
Yes, I believe that a number of legal principles were violated in this instance, in what I would describe as an unethical breach of privacy. But, in the US system, this breach of privacy is overshadowed by features of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, so I don't believe that in the US system they would be found liable.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. Now we have an overview and legal perspective. Let's take a look at the ethical codes journalists use to self-regulate.
Good idea, Anya. There are many different ethical codes journalists can refer to. The Media, Entertainment and Art Alliance, or MEAA, offer an ethical code that is widely applied by Australian media practitioners. When you apply these codes to this case, it is clear to see where the principles were breached. The first code that was breached states that journalists must aim to attribute information to its source. Where a source seeks anonymity, do not agree without first considering the source's motives and any alternative attributable source. In the case of the journalist who brought the picture of Bobby Christina Brown in her casket, it is clear that they either neglected to consider the ulterior motives of this source, or considered it and thought it worthy price to pay for the success of the story. The second code that was violated states that journalists must use fair, responsible, and honest means to obtain material. This code continues to state that a journalist should never exploit a person's vulnerability. Clearly, the journalist who brought the image of Bobby Christina Brown failed to use honest and fair means to obtain the image. It could be argued that the journalist was also potentially exploiting the vulnerability of the grieving family member. The final code that was breached states that a journalist must respect grief and personal privacy. Journalists also have the right to resist compulsion to intrude. This code is the primary code that was breached in this case. By purchasing and using the image of Brown for their own personal gain, the journalist has clearly wavered their respect for the family's grief and personal privacy.
I'm joined by the MEAA representative, Thomas Pillowman, who is here to talk about the conflicts journalists often encounter while trying to adhere to these codes. Thanks for joining us here today, Thomas.
Oh, no worries.
So tell me, what happens to a journalist who breaches one or more of the ethical codes in the MEAA outlines?
Well, a number of things can happen to a journalist who breaches our codes. At the very least, a journalist will experience a loss of integrity. However, if a case such as this were to occur in Australia, it could even go further than this. The Australian Law Reform Commission has announced a scheme that would make it plausible to sue the media for serious invasions of privacy.
I see. So why is it that anyone would try and break these codes?
Well, there's a bit of a conflict of interest between some of the codes and the fundamental principles of journalism. Respect for truth and for the public's right to information are central to journalistic practice. Journalism embodies a practical form of the freedom of expression, which comes under the Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. It's this balance between a person's right to privacy and the right to expression and freedom of the press that presents a grey area in some of our codes.
Surely this becomes even more complex when it comes to the privacy of a celebrity?
Well, yes, celebrity exists in two ways, as a public commodity and as a private individual. As a public commodity, they have the responsibility to stay in the public eye, but as private individuals, they have the same civil and political rights as you and me, and one of these rights is obviously privacy. And that's why journalists are bound by various ethical codes to respect the personal privacy, regardless of who it is they're reporting on. On the other hand, the very nature of journalism binds them to report on the matters of public interest. It is this argument that many journalists use to justify violating an individual's privacy. And in my opinion, a lot of journalists get away with using this defence in more than they ought to.
I see. So just to wrap up, why don't you tell us a little bit more about why journalists have these ethic codes?
Well, the fact of the matter is that the codes that we outline are a way of navigating through a situation such as the Bobby Christina Brown case. These codes present deontological approach to ethical decision making. The codes we make at the MEAA have set out based on deontological principles of universalizability, reversibility, and the respect for others. Universalizability is the idea that you should only do something that would make sense to someone, to have everyone to do. For example, it makes no sense to have everyone going around murdering each other because there'd be none of us left. And now reversibility, that's the golden rule. So do unto others as you'd had done to yourself. And also respect for others, that's fairly self-explanatory. It just asks that you, resist treating others as a means to an end. Yep, and you can see all these values throughout our codes, which in themselves respect the core deontological principles of rights and justice. However, some believe that consequentialist values ought to also be applied to journalistic practices in combination with our codes in order to make the best decisions.
On that note, I'll pass on to Tim, who has some insights into how consequentialism can influence journalistic practices.
Consequentialism is an approach to ethics that focuses on the rightness or wrongness of the consequences of an act. Under the consequentialist approach, there are three schools of thought. The first is egoism, which concentrates on the good an action can have for oneself. Sometimes, journalists can slip into school of consequentialism, which can find them in ethically questionable situations. It could be argued here that the journalist who purchased the photo was acting egoistically. The second school of thought is altruism, in which a person selflessly considers the welfare of others in the consequences of their actions. The altruism is the opposite of egoism. Finally, we have utilitarianism, which asks a person to consider whether their actions will do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It could be argued that the journalist was acting under a utilitarian philosophy when they purchased the photograph, as the publishing of the image benefits the family member who sold it, the journalist, the other workers at the newspaper who benefit from the success of the story, and to an extent the public. It could be argued that the journalist placed the benefit of these people over the wrong the action did to the family. Consequentialism in journalism asks practitioners to consider the impact their actions have or not have on not just the public, but also individuals and smaller stakeholder groups. The conflict seen in this case is the right to expression and information versus the duty to cause minimal harm to a person. This exemplifies the kind of conflicts deontological and consequentialist reasonings can have for a journalist.
In this episode of the discussion, we looked at the case of Bobby Christina Brown, the question of whether a celebrity's right to privacy is different to the everyday man or woman, brought some interesting insights into what makes a person public or a private person, and the trade of privacy for fame. A celebrity makes their living by being a public commodity, by making their life of public interest. When you apply this knowledge to journalism, it brings a whole new element to the conflict of the right to privacy versus the right to free press, information and expression. In Australia, the way in which we prioritize these rights is different from the US.
US privacy torts show that publicising private matters is only a liable offence if the matter is highly offensive and not of legitimate concern to the public. The problem this highlights is whether the public's right to information ought to trump an individual's right to privacy. We explored how it is a journalist's duty to convey matters of public interest and how this further complicates the case. However, upon exploring Australian journalism ethics codes, we saw that journalists also have a duty to respect the privacy of others, and specifically a person's right to grieve. This, once again, brings us to the conflict of the right to privacy versus the right to expression and information. Concluding on whether or not this case is ethically sound hinges upon your weighing of these rights. In the US, the parties involved in the sale/purchase of the photograph were protected by the Bill of Rights and Constitution, both of which give the right to free press and the right to expression. In other countries, such as Australia, freedom of expression is governed by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In countries such as Australia, privacy and expression are both seen as equally vital rights, allowing for a case like this to be evaluated on a level playing field. Given the harm and distress caused unto Bobby Christina Brown, the violation of journalism ethics codes, and the breach of privacy, we conclude that the capture and sale of Bobby Christina Brown's casket picture is not only ethically questionable, but if it were to occur in Australia, it could even be punishable by the law.
Well, there you have it. Catch us next time for more of the discussion.